Hello, welcome to White Threads FlossTube number 42. Thank you so much for joining me today. Now, in the last video, I showed you some Ethiopian crosses and some Ethiopian embroidery. And I noted that on most of the crosses, there were little birds. And this was not something that I'd noticed before, but I pointed it out because I had noticed it. Well, a friend of mine, John, who has an Ethiopian Orthodox priest friend, Mengistu, I think it's probably a G like that and not Mengistu. I'd say it's Mengistu. He asked Mengistu what the birds were, and of course they symbolise doves, and doves symbolise the Holy Spirit. So there you go, that's what the birds are for. Thank you so much for asking, John, and for checking that out for me. I really appreciate it. So today I'm going to do a demonstration for you of reverse chain stitch. Now, reverse chain stitch can be used in any situation where chain stitch is called for. I just find that it provides a better result than regular chain stitch. You can be more accurate with it, and if you're using a rigid thread, it can just be easier to manipulate. So I'm going to show you a demonstration of both normal chain stitch and reverse chain stitch, so you can see the difference in how they work, and also I'll talk a bit about the situations where you might find that reverse is better than regular chain stitch, and hint hint, I always think it's better, though I do find that if I'm not thinking about it, I'll just do a regular chain stitch because that's just what comes to mind first, and then I'll think, oh, I should have slowed this down and done a reverse chain stitch. Anyway, I'll show them to you and you'll be able to see the difference. So places where it might be useful, you will probably remember, or you may remember, this piece that I stitched quite some number of years ago. And when you're working with a gold thread, such as the one that I used for this, so this is a T71 Benton and Johnson passing thread, and for the little bits, the chain stitch, I used T72 Benton and Johnson passing thread. And they're quite a, well, what's the word? It's a thread that doesn't have a lot of easy movement. It's quite rigid and stiff. And so getting it to go around tight curves can be quite difficult. And that's why using a reverse chain stitch can work much better for that. So today I will show you how to do the reverse chain stitch and give you an idea of why you might want to do it in future rather than normal chain stitch. I have a piece of T72 Benton and Johnson gold passing thread threaded into my needle. It's a big fat chenille needle to make a hole that's large enough for that to go through the fabric okay. I've talked previously about how to choose the right needle size, so you can go back and review that video if you would like to. I will just start with my thread sitting over at the side and bring it up. Now, first of all, I'm going to demonstrate to you just regular chain stitch. I'm not going to put a knot in that. I'm just going to leave it sitting there. It'll probably come out, but hopefully it won't. Okay, so generally you insert your needle. I'm doing this left to right because I am left-handed, and that's just the way it seems sensible for me to do it. You might want to do it in the other option with the other hand. That's fine, go right ahead. So I've inserted my needle back into the same hole, or right next to where it came out of, and now I'm bringing it out a little way further along within the great big loop that the thread made. Okay, so you can see here it's really quite difficult to pull that through because there's just not a lot of movement with this thread. It's quite rigid. So I've gone back into the same hole, back into there, through the chain, not outside the chain, and coming out a little way further along again. And this is going to take a bit of effort to pull through again because it's just such rigid thread. So back into the same hole, a little way out further along, and pull through, and it requires great manipulation. And when you're using a thread like this, when you're pulling it like that, it can very easily break. So this is made of a central core of cotton with gold, a flat piece of gold wound around it, and it is quite fragile. So if you pull it too much, too hard, if you make it too much of an angle, like where it goes through there, the gold part will break. You just have to accept that. So this is why you wouldn't really want to do this stitch with this version of it. So you wouldn't generally want to go with a normal chain stitch. You want to do reverse. Okay, so I'm going to finish that off there just with a stitch over the end, and you can see how this doesn't want to behave. That is the nature of gold thread and sewing with a gold thread. Okay, so that's regular chain stitch, and it's not the most appropriate stitch to use with this thread. I'm going to start my reverse chain stitch from this end, and I'm going to go backwards. We are doing it in reverse, as the name says. Now there are two ways to start this. You can see already that that has broken there, and you can see the core through there, so that's going to become harder to pull through. Okay, so I'm going to start there. There are two ways to start this, and I'm going to start with just the simple version. No, I've got to fix that already. Okay, just excuse me. Okay, so needle rethreaded, tiny little tail so that I'm losing as little as possible each time when that happens, and I have to cut it off and rethread. Okay, so I start with just a straight stitch and I take that through. Now I come out at the far end of the stitch, so I'm going to be working the same thing but in reverse. So I'm coming out at this end of this stitch and pull it through, and then you can either go from above or below, and you're just going to thread the needle under that stitch. So if it's sitting up a little way, that can be helpful. Mine is not. There we are. So I've lifted that up, and I'm just going to take it through underneath that. And you can see how that sits quite easily, and then back into the same hole. So you can see how that sits more plump and open and round. These ones are more elongated and squished that way, whereas this is much more open and round. So it provides better shaped stitches with a thread like this, but it also, and so I brought it out at the far end of the stitch in line with that, and I'm going to go underneath those two threads there. Be careful not to catch any of the fabric in as you do this. You can see that there is a fair amount of manipulation happening because it's still not easy to work with this thread. And back into that same hole. And then out at the far end again. It's got a little wiggle underneath, back under them. Stop it. Back into the same hole. So you can see that it's much more easy to get accurate stitch placing when you're going back into the same hole rather than coming out of your chain and trying to get the same hole each time. So it's much more accurate. And this stitch can be substituted any time a regular chain stitch is specified, because it will provide the same but actually a better looking result, and no one will know that you did this version than the other version. They'll just think you have very nice looking chain stitch. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. There is another way to start this, and that is to actually start with a whole chain at the end. So back into the same hole, and my thread's broken off again, so I'll need to fix that, excuse me. Okay, that's ready to go again. Now why does that keep happening? It's because this passing thread is not actually meant to be used to be sewn with. It's only meant to be couched down really, but this was the best thread I found available to use that provided the right sort of look that I wanted for doing my Elizabethan embroidery. Okay, so you start off with a single chain and you take that over the end like that, and it doesn't want to behave. And then you come out at the far end of the next one. So you just start with a chain rather than a single stitch, and then you go under them forevermore like that. Now I am doing this quickly. If I was doing this for a piece of work rather than just a sample, I would take much more time and have my stitches sitting much more carefully than what I'm doing here. Back into the same hole again, and out for the last one. And then back in for that one. Okay, so these two at the bottom here are reverse chain stitch, and that one is regular chain stitch. So it's easier to manipulate the thread when you have a gold thread that you're working with that is so rigid. It's also easier to get your needle or your thread, both ends of your chain, coming out through exactly the same hole than it is this way, because you're inserting back into the hole rather than coming out through here. So you're limited by that being in the way. It helps you it means you can see it less, and then it makes it harder to come out through the same hole. So as I said before, you can use any thread you want to do this. You can use it in any situation. It will be probably a little bit slower to start off with, but you will find you get much more accurate stitches. I hope that gave you a good understanding of how to do reverse chain stitch and why you might choose to use it over normal chain stitch. If you have any questions about it, please just ask. Remember, it's useful in all situations, not just for doing gold work. Showing it with a gold work thread can be useful because it has such rigidity and is quite difficult to manipulate as compared to normal threads. So thank you for joining me today. If you haven't subscribed yet, I would absolutely love it if you did, and I look forward to you joining me next time. Thanks very much.